I recently came across this article about a 42-year-old millionaire and his wife who tried to retire early on $250,000 of passive income but failed, and he shares what went wrong. In this video, I want to talk about his story because of how unique his situation is and 3 profound lessons from his mistakes that have serious consequences for anyone pursuing early retirement. In 2012, Sam Dogan quit his 6-figure job in investment banking and retired at 34. After 13 years in corporate finance, he finally called it quits with a net worth of around $3 million. He was already a millionaire by the time he turned 28 because of his extreme frugality and lucrative career, so it was only a matter of time. For 7 years, he writes that he lived a charmed life in early retirement with his wife, who was also retired from her finance job 3 years after he did, and together they earned roughly $250,000 in passive income per year, mostly from dividend stocks, savings accounts, bonds, and rental income. During their retirement, he and his wife traveled to 20 different countries, coached a few high school tennis teams to conference championships, consulted for some tech companies, and eventually had 2 kids by 2019. But then by the end of that year, he writes they were no longer comfortable living the early retirement lifestyle, especially in an expensive city like San Francisco. According to the California Association of Realtors, you need a minimum household income of $309,000 to afford a median-priced home in SF, which is around $1.6 million, which meant his family was short $60,000 per year. Now, Sam isn't just some random dude off the street who was trying out early retirement just for kicks. If you've done any Google search on personal finance topics or on investing, you might have already read his work. He happens to be the founder of Financial Samurai, a personal finance blog that gets over 1 million visitors a month. According to his words, he has written 3 articles a week on his blog for 12 straight years, which is an impressive feat. Everything from ranking the best passive income investments to how much should I have saved in my 401k by age to the definitive guide to farmland investing. He has a wealth of knowledge that exceeds most, and he helps millions of people understand complex topics in finance and investing. So when he admits that he failed at early retirement, it's worth hearing what he has to say. At this point, you might be thinking, is this guy serious? How privileged and bourgeois do you have to be unable to retire with $250,000? And I have to agree that he can sound a bit tone deaf to how ordinary people afford to live. With $250,000, that's nearly 4 times the median household income. With the exception of the Bay Area, New York, and a handful of major cities, that kind of income could buy you a decent single-family home outright. So if he's so money savvy and wants to stay retired, why doesn't he just move to somewhere cheaper? But if we can set aside the judgment, the outrageousness, and sort of his detachment from the lower 95% of all income earners, he is frankly honest about what went wrong, and I think we can learn from his experience. Because at the end of the day, whether you're looking to retire with $40,000 or $250,000, I think we can relate to his mistakes because our early retirement plans could be derailed by them too. They don't affect just the wealthy. The first mistake he admits was making assumptions about long-term economic conditions. Specifically, we're talking about recency bias, which is a type of bias that favors recent events over historic ones. And I think this is a big warning for a lot of investors today. I'm going to talk more on this in a moment, but I'm going to go back to the article. He writes that he underestimated how low interest rates would go, that he was a believer of low interest rates for life, but didn't think the 10-year bond yield would ever drop to below 1.5% in 2019. So this is a 10-year bond yield going back 5 years. The article was published in December 2019, so it's a bit dated, but here's where the yield drops down and dips to 1.5, and then by year end, he throws in a towel because it just wasn't working for him. In other words, he got spooked. The reason being is that he talks at length in this paragraph about the amount of capital needed to maintain $50,000 in fixed income and how the lower yield makes sustaining that income very challenging without taking on more risk, aka reallocating to stocks. So my guess is that he must have had a disproportionate amount of his income coming from fixed income investments like bonds. So the next question is, why would he have assumed rates wouldn't dip below 1.5%? Well, if we look at the 10-year yield going back 10 years, it's averaged around 2 to 2.5%. At the time, no one could have predicted a once-in-a-century pandemic would have tanked the yield to a record low of 0.5%. Fortunately for Sam, he got spooked at 1.5 and came out of retirement. If he didn't, I'm sure he would have had many sleepless nights when the yield dropped further. His assumption was flawed because of recency bias. He retired early thinking that rates had hit rock bottom in 2012, and it didn't occur to him that it could fall further. The bias of weighing recent events more favorably than older events or ignoring them altogether affects us all. And the dangers posed by this extends to how you invest in the stock market. Many of us are in the middle of growing and accumulating our wealth by investing in stocks and index funds. In the last 11 years, we've seen record-breaking growth led by big tech companies, the top 10 of which make up more than 50% of the NASDAQ index. This shows the QQQ ETF, which tracks the NASDAQ in red, and a more diversified S&P 500 ETF in blue. Since 2009, the NASDAQ has outpaced the broader index by more than 2-to-1 margin. So if you only started investing in the last 10 years, it is tempting to think that this is how the stock market operates because this is all you've known. If you're attempting to beat the market, you may be biased towards investing in big tech companies, which are the hottest companies today. But if we look at the decade prior to that, the NASDAQ index was trailing the broader S&P 500 by a 1-to-2 margin. It's almost the exact opposite from the most recent decade. A $10,000 investment in the NASDAQ starting in 2000 would have lost you over $4,000. Now, obviously, this is coming on the heels of the dot-com bubble, and 8 years isn't a whole lot of time. But my point is, we can't predict what will happen in the next 10, 20 years. And so the takeaway is assuming what will happen to the stock market or the economy based on what we've seen recently is a dangerous assumption, but it's a bias a lot of people have difficulty separating from. I want to close this point with a clip from Warren Buffett at the 2021 annual Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting. In this clip, he asks the audience to look at a list of today's biggest companies and guess which ones will be around 30 years from now.
But what I would like you to do is look at that list for a minute or two, if you want to, and then make an estimate, make your own guess. How many of those companies are going to be on the list 30 years from now? Here they are, these powerhouses. And how many would you guess are going to be on the list? Well, you know, it's not going to be all 20. It may not even be all 20 today or tomorrow. Because this was March 31st. But what would you guess? And think about that yourself. Would you put on 5, 8? Well, whatever it would be, I would now invite you to look at slide 2, or L2, which goes back a little more than 30 years, and look at the top 20 from 1989. And if you look at the top 20 from 1989, there's 2 things that should grab your interest, at least 2. None of the 20 from 30 years ago are on the present list. None. 0. There were then 6 U.S. companies on the list, and their names are familiar to you. We have General Electric, we have Exxon, we have IBM Corp. I mean, they're still around. Merck is down there at number. None made it to the list 30 years later, 0. And I would guess that very few of you, when I asked you to play the quiz a few minutes ago, would have put down 0. And I don't think it will be 0. But it is a reminder of what extraordinary things can happen, things that seem obvious to you. Japan had this wonderful bull market for a very long time, so you had a number of Japanese companies on the list. Today there are none. And the United States had the 6, now we have 13. But they aren't the same 6.
So yeah, Warren Buffett is making the point that don't assume the top companies today will remain at the top 30 years from now. Keep your recency bias in check, and as Sam alluded to, don't underestimate how quick economic conditions could change when you're investing for early retirement. Before moving on, if you're getting any value from this video, be sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel for more videos on financial freedom and retiring early. The next mistake you made was underestimating how difficult it is to adapt your finances and investments to major life changes once you retire early. This is not something he specifically mentions, but it's a theme that keeps coming up in his article. When he lists the main reasons why he needed to come out of early retirement, It's no secret that raising 2 kids while living in San Francisco means your costs are going to shoot up. And not only that, but he also calls out rising health insurance premiums. He laments that he's going to have to pay north of $23,000 before co-insurance and co-pays. Obviously, if you decide to retire early and you ignore the cost of future lifestyle decisions, like having a child, buying a house, getting a car, or any major life choices, then you need to reconsider how much money you need to invest for retirement. The total living expenses you anticipate at the time you retire is unlikely to remain the same years and decades down the road. But it's not just rising costs that put pressure on early retirees, but also the fact that making adjustments to your finances while in retirement can be really challenging. One example Sam points out is that he considered paying off his mortgage by selling his other investments. Now, ignoring the ridiculous fact that he retired early in San Francisco, had kids, and on top of all that, he still had a mortgage on his home, his concern was that paying it off would allocate too much net worth to real estate than he would feel comfortable with. And also selling those investments would trigger capital gains and a bigger tax bill. Had he not retired early and stayed at his job a bit longer, he might have anticipated his higher living costs and paid down his mortgage more aggressively and allocated additional capital to his other investments so he could maintain his net worth allocation. But without that income, his choices are limited. The bottom line is, being able to retire early is meant to give you choices on how you spend your time, but the downside is if you aren't prepared, it can limit your flexibility to handle the costs of big life decisions that you can't always anticipate. The next mistake he talks about is that the bliss of early retirement didn't last very long. After a few years, he wanted to do something more productive than playing tennis and sleeping in. And it's not just Sam, but I've heard this from many early retirees that early retirement life can be really, really boring before you know it, and the feeling of being unproductive isn't very healthy. The problem isn't just about what you plan to do with your free time in retirement, but it's a misguided mindset. So my warning is to not make financial freedom the goal in and of itself. Don't pursue financial freedom with the mindset of making it the destination, but it should instead be a journey. Don't be surprised if you find that early retirement won't make you any happier in the long run than you are already right now. Instead, find something worth pursuing in early retirement so that you are pulled into it because you get to do something you absolutely love. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.